Thank you, everyone, and thank you to Hong Kong FILMART for inviting me and MPA to share some perspectives today through the pandemic on post-COVID-19. It's been a challenging time for all of us, and also for the media and entertainment industry. And we wanted to highlight some level of trends that we're seeing in the marketplace, some challenging, but also some green shoots, particularly focused on the growth of online video. My understanding is there is Q&A on this session, so please post questions and I will try and address them after this presentation is over. So let's start. So as we focus on the growth of online video, I think as we move to our next graphic, we just want to really focus on the state of the nation over the last 3 years and then come to what we're seeing in 2020 and beyond. So we've chosen a few important markets from our perspective that reflect what's happening in the market for premium video. So for premium entertainment, premium sports, and of course movies included in the entertainment, but we're excluding platforms such as YouTube and such like out of this analysis. And as we can see in these markets, they're all significant markets. Korea, more than $10 billion. The key markets in Southeast Asia here accounting for more than $6 billion. They're fairly robust media and entertainment markets as of last year. And you can see it divided by television, online video, including subscription and advertising, ex-YouTube, and of course, box office. And generally, television is still a very, very important driver in these markets, accounting for on average 80% of the sector. Box office contributed another 12 to 15% on average, and the rest, around 5 to 8%, excluding YouTube, was online video. Now, as we see later, that 5 to 8% has grown this year, and we'll see significant growth in the future through the pandemic. And how it impacts television and box office is really going to be the key point. In terms of incremental growth, which is the right-hand chart, over the last 3 years, 17 to 19, is very interesting because while television has this big scale, it hasn't really contributed to incremental growth for various structural reasons. Online videos contributed more than 50% to incremental new growth in some of the key Southeast Asian markets. In Thailand, it's had a significant contribution, more than 80%. In Malaysia, 64%. Philippines, 58%. Thailand, Indonesia, just over 20%. Indonesia, 29%. So that is incremental growth. So for every new dollar that comes to the ecosystem. Television is still strong in Korea at more than 60% of incremental growth. That's largely because of the IPTV operators that have movies and entertainment through their TVOD services, through the set-top box in that market. Indonesia, because you have a fairly robust and healthy free-to-air sector. TVs accounted for more than 50%. But in Thailand and Malaysia, it hasn't really got a look in. And in Philippines, it's been fairly small at around 6%. It's also important to know that the box office with theatrical has also contributed quite significantly in some of these markets, around 20 to 30% in some of these markets. In Indonesia, it's been around 25%, Malaysia 36%, and the Philippines 35%. Indonesia and Thailand, strong markets for free-to-air, have been very impacted this year, along with Malaysia, where Astro's premium pay TV base has also contracted. But box office revenues really have been hit across the region, and a lot of players have responded to move content online, and we'll see if that has a lasting impact on the ecosystem. Now, as we move to the next chart, the big positive green shoot from this year is really for the first time people through the pandemic have started paying on a relatively sustained basis online. I would still argue we're very much now in the first innings of this movement. There's still a long way to go, and there's a lot of interesting players coming to the market. We'll talk about that later. But obviously the proliferation of broadband, along with varied periods of the lockdown in markets, have enabled the growth of SVOD in these markets. So close to 8.5 million subscribers are expected to come into these new markets in aggregate this year, which is significant. In Korea, that number is close to 3 million. In Indonesia, over 2 million. In Philippines, close to 1.5 million. Thailand, 1.2. Malaysia, about 500,000. Netflix and View dominate a lot of the gains in Southeast Asia. Netflix has now acquired 1 million customers or more in a couple of Southeast Asia markets. View has reached significant scalability in Indonesia and Thailand, and continues to grow steadily in markets like Malaysia and of course also in Hong Kong. And then in Korea, we've seen significant growth for Netflix and also local players such as Wave in that market. In Indonesia, we've also seen significant growth of a local player called Video. So let's go to the next graphic, which kind of digs a little bit deeper into these numbers. This trend of subscriber growth on SVOD is playing out in different ways. The SVOD monthly blended ARPUs are declining in emerging markets. So the cost of these services is becoming incredibly more affordable, particularly with mobile pricing introduced by Netflix and low ARPU pricing introduced by other players. And I'm sure we've all seen the pricing that Disney Plus Hotstar has announced for Indonesia, which is incredibly low given the trend of data consumption and data costs in that market. So generally, the local platforms who produce and curate premium local and regional content, plus some of the regional players, have brought down prices. And as I said, Netflix has rolled out cheaper mobile-only plans in all these markets. So as a result, Philippines has gone down from, say, a blended average cost across the sector at around $6 per month 3 years ago to now $4. Thailand's gone from, again, 6 to 3. Indonesia's gone down from 5 to 2.5 and probably will go down further. And India's gone down from 1.6, 1.7 to much below to $1 and will probably go down further. The other encouraging thing is that households on average are subscribing to multiple services to cater to their multiple content preferences. So the average subscriptions per household are growing. India from 2.1 at the end of Q4 2019 to 3.0. The Philippines from 2 to 3, and Thailand from 1.7 to 2.8. Indonesia less so around 1.6 to 2.6. It's catching up. Indonesia is still an emerging market for SVOD, so it'll be interesting to see how it goes. If you go to the next graphic, it's important to look at cross-consumption across these various different players, which is really defined as platforms, user streaming, at least 1 minute of another service in the period. And this leverages our proprietary research tracker, Apt Research. And this was measured during the second quarter of this year. So as OTT adoption grows, a lot of customers are very willing to try and adopt various platforms to cater to their content preferences and needs. So across Southeast Asia, the common theme really is Netflix and View lead a lot of active consumption, along with one local player. In Singapore, 2/3 of View's users and 1/2 of MeWatch users, MeWatch is owned by MediaCorp, also consume Netflix. HBO Go is growing, but it's currently number 4. In Thailand, View, Line TV, and Tencent's VTV are growing what we classify as their freemium customer bases. And we see a significant cross-consumption between these 3 services. Now, what's also happening is also the investment in content and acquisition of movies, acquisition of dramas is growing quite significantly. It's already reached, significant proportions in certain markets and will continue to grow over the next 3 years. Now, this doesn't look at sports, it just looks at movies and series. So despite this crisis, SVOD platforms are making aggressive investments in local content. So we've seen aggressive investment in local and vernacular originals, and also shifting movies from from theatrical to online happened probably the most aggressively in India at this time, because of the issues of theatrical releases in that market. So you can see India this year will reach $700 million, and this is expected to scale up to $1.1, $1.2 billion by 2022. We're also seeing this trend in Korea. Netflix has led the way quite substantially in that market over 2020 and over next year as it gains real traction in the market. And we're seeing other players also invest in acquisitions of dramas and movies and so forth. But you're seeing significant growth, and we will continue to see that over the next few years. And then, of course, while they're still small, they are inching up slowly: Indonesia, Thailand, and Philippines. Here, you're seeing some of the local players move quite aggressively on things like series and entertainment in Indonesia. But really, the bulk of the investment has come not just from Netflix and View, but also we're seeing a lot of competition over movies in the main, particularly in a market like Indonesia, between Netflix and Disney Plus Hotstar, which is now launching in Indonesia and Thailand, in both those markets over the next few months and through 2020 and 21. And then we're seeing other scale up, as I suggested, with Netflix, WeTV, iQIYI, and View, with high spends also from local incumbents, such as video. So a fairly healthy number. As I said, India will reach more than $1.1 billion by 2022. Korea, $530 million by that time. Indonesia, 150 million plus, which is quite significant given the fact that, you know, you've had players like Hook and iFlix collapse in that market. So they're almost doubling up in that market, or just for online. Thailand around 140, 150, and Philippines at about 115. So looking at through the sort of pandemic, what's happened is obviously you've seen a lot more people move online. We've talked about cheaper services, more mobile plans, more aggressive distribution, more investment in content, and that, along with the fact that people have been staying at home, has really increased video streaming minutes, which have grown considerably on the back of many first-time SVOD users who continue to explore a lot of the premium libraries being offered by these services. So the first quarter of this year saw a 30% increase in consumption, and the second quarter has also seen decent amount of robust growth of almost 20%. Philippines and Indonesia leading the growth charts. Continues to be the number one and has grown almost 60% in the region. View leads the freemium segment, followed by a lot of the in-country local players such as Video, Line TV, and WeTV. And iQIYI is growing on the back of Chinese content after a soft launch in Southeast Asia. And I'm sure we'll see more to come going forward. And just in terms of looking at the consumption here, and this obviously is really, includes movies, includes dramas, even more the consumption patterns across premium video in the region. It dominates the top 20 titles across the region, particularly because, the two leading players have increased their investments substantially in this category, View and Netflix. So 30 to 40% of some of the top Netflix titles are Korean, while View's top shows are mostly Korean, though they have some local originals. And Indonesia and Thailand shows decent appetite for local content predominantly. You can see that with trends really driving in Indonesia with local content by players such as Video, and in Thailand by players such as Line TV. Can't ignore Chinese and Hollywood categories. They are growing. Chinese and Hollywood really complete the pie in Singapore. And of course, Hollywood dominates the Philippines after Korea. So as we look at how these platforms are positioned, for the future and what happened, it kind of leads us to an interesting space as we see in the next graphic. Just move across that. You can see the positioning of all these different. Oh, can we go back? Can we go back? Can we go? I think we're just dropping a lot. No, we've gone back too far now. We just need to go to page 9. Page 9. So as we look at the content offering of these regional players, it's all fairly clear, and demarcation lines are very, interesting, and you can see View very focused in the Asian category, local originals, which I'm sure will be future. And then you've obviously got Netflix across in Indian and so forth. Local original. Indonesia, and you'll see a lot more of their product, but you can see they're bringing some of the Hotstar Indian content to the market, other Asian content, and a lot of local movies. So I think that's just it. And of course, the tentpoles from Disney and Fox in the US Western, and then HBO has Asian content and US Western content. So you see a wide sort of space going forward to do more and more kind of local content in these markets, particularly. Korean obviously travels really well. We've seen a lot of competition over local movies in Indonesia, but the wide space is really local series. No one has really focused and scaled on that offering yet in these markets, and that could be an interesting sort of battleground for local players in Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, but also for Netflix and View, who've been in these markets for some time and will be really looking at that space. We think, the theatrical sector in these markets is watching what happens a lot with Mulan, which goes on Disney Plus on September the 4th, the shortening of theatrical windows, because that really will inform how things develop. There's no doubt we need a theatrical sector, but there's a potential for theatrical to really consolidate, become more of a premium experience, and online to really get a lot more movie products as well going forward, particularly as theatrical in these markets doesn't look like it's going to really replicate what it did in 2019 until at least 2022-23, because it's going to take, as things come back to normal through the pandemic next year, it's going to take some time for economics to be restored, and therefore online will see that as a significant opportunity. Thank you very much for allowing us to share some of these perspectives with you, and now I will invite some questions. So I think there is a question from an anonymous attendee on what are the strengths of Asian OTT platforms compared to Western ones. Look, I think as I've mentioned, some of the key local platforms also have very strong television businesses. Obviously, TVB in Hong Kong and SCMA in Indonesia and so forth. And so they have a very, very strong production engine for their free TV services. And they're using that to not only drive the sort of free tier or the AVOD offering of their core business, but also start to diversify and understand and how to program premium content to get people paying for that content. So someone like Video has 600,000 paying customers at the end of June this year in Indonesia, because they're able to put some decent premium original content locally on it, and also live stream various sports and entertainment services. And I think that's a key differentiator, that they understand the local audience, certainly in television a lot, and they're trying to work through with partners, particularly in Indonesia, to produce compelling series and content. And I think the global OTT platforms, I'm not sure if you say Western or so forth, but I think they are clearly have great product already that they program in the US and content that travels, but they are also working to invest in the local markets. I think that's important to consider to serve a premium audience. There's another question here. How's the future of the OTT platform after COVID-19? I think we've answered that question. That was the purpose of this presentation. Any other Asian countries and regions that you see particular growth potential? Look at we're seeing continued growth in the China market the first half of this year through SWOT, Tencent in particular, reporting very, very robust numbers for their and then we're also seeing decent levels of growth in the Taiwan market on OTT, so fairly decent amount of potential. And there will be potential in Vietnam. We haven't seen that yet through SWOT. We're seeing that more obviously through online connectivity and paying, and then through AVOD. I also forgot to mention Japan, obviously, where we're seeing significant growth, steady growth, non-exponential growth in the premium SVOD base in that market as well. About documentary, what is the regional consumption and streaming digital landscape in 2020 so far? Look, the documentary, to be fair, it doesn't really show up in most of these markets that I've featured in there. There are a couple of shows that come through in Korea, you know, and there's been some documentary shows that have sort of done pretty well on the Netflix platform in some of these markets. We haven't really seen a significant focus on it beyond Netflix. I think in some of the local platforms yet, they seem to be much more entertainment skewed, but I'm sure that will change in the future. Yeah, I think there's a good question about audio products and podcasts and so forth. Well, we've seen obviously Spotify move that way. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any streaming platform move onto that strategy yet, to be frank. We've seen a lot of behind the scenes documentaries and so forth around sport and everything else, but we haven't seen that yet. It seems to be just very much a video focus on that. Sharif Haq, what about the China and Japan market? Who are the dominant players there? Which platforms are gaining this year? Look, as I've said, you know, I'm happy to share that offline. You can contact me on email or contact the person on email. There's a lot of perspective on China. We've seen obviously a significant growth, as I said, of Tencent Video and iQIYI and a couple of other players, a decent amount of growth in SVOD, but we've also seen a fairly, you know, China's been impacted on the ad ecosystem. But, you know, there's 4 big players that dominate digital video advertising. Obviously, ByteDance has come in a few years ago and really commoditized that inventory in that market with dramatic impact. So it has a lot of competitive effect. But we're also seeing through COVID, the key players be a lot more prudent about content costs, and there's also been talk about consolidation. I think in Japan, there's you know, it's a fairly healthy SVOD market in the sense that it may not have the exponential growth, say, that Australia's had in the last few years, but Netflix, Amazon Prime, obviously through local series and variety, Netflix through Hollywood, anime, and some of the local shows they've done, Hulu Japan, through also local content, and then 2 or 3 or 4 other players. There's about 6 or 7 players that have about 60 to 65% of revenues in that market. But, you know, in total, there's about 15 platforms in Japan. So it's a fairly scalable market because people are used to paying online. But what's interesting about Japan, you know, other forms of media, DVD, television, and theatrical haven't really gone away, COVID notwithstanding. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there in the future. Let me just see if there's I think with Myanmar, look, it's interesting. We're seeing a lot of the telco infrastructure happen there. Obviously, View has launched in Myanmar and performed fairly creditably. I think that's going to be an important category to look at, emerging market to look at. Okay, I think that should wraps it up. There's a couple of other questions here which I'm not sure we can do, but Just let me look at this. Can platforms survive on subscriptions incomes alone? What changes do you advise? Yeah, I think, obviously we've showed examples with players like View and Video who have a dual income streams of subscription and advertising. So I think people are looking at that, and some are also looking at integration into gaming and also integration into commerce, as your question observes. So those are all future revenue streams. But also sometimes it's important to just have focus on solving problems for consumers who want to pay, and advertisers who are very encouraged by having alternatives to YouTube for premium advertising, rather than having too many things and going on and too many times. It's sort of somewhat distracting to the team and to the business model that you're trying to develop. Certainly social commerce and gaming is upsides for the future. But I think the key thing is, as I said, we're in the first innings of this movement to monetize digitally online. And there's been a lot of progress being made in the last 12 months. So I think a lot of the key players want to stick with that and develop on this thing. How does Quibi rank within this on the online platform? I'm afraid Quibi didn't really, it's small, it's low. We have happy to share with you a presentation, but it's very, very niche. There are other players like Tubi in the US that do quite well in the Philippines, and is also launched in Australia, and obviously TikTok, which isn't covered here, but is covered in our YouTube, Facebook ecosystem, is quite significant in a lot of these markets. But Quibi, in terms of the premium video side, it doesn't really feature. Thank you very much. I think that wraps my session up, and I appreciate the people who have attended, and thank you. Goodbye.